Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator here. So one thing that gets spoken of a lot in books on arms and armour, and people on the internet who are saying things that they know about arms and armour and they heard a person say, and this is a fact, is that crossbows were the only weapon banned by the Pope. In this case it was Pope Innocent II in 1139. Now, I was vaguely aware, I've gone and researched this, I am holding a laptop here certainly, I've been and researched this because I remember reading about this previously and discovering that that's not actually correct. That's not to say that the Pope didn't speak out against crossbows. The Pope, Innocent II, in 1139, at the Second Lateran Council, did indeed talk about crossbows and the fact that they shouldn't be used against other Christians. And this is what's often written in books. People go, you know, crossbows were so formidable, so amazingly awesome, that even the Pope, presumably with God talking in his right ear or something, came down and said, no, you can't use crossbows against Christians, you must only use them against the infidel or whatever. And I was vaguely aware of the fact that actually there was more to this than just that, and it is the case. So what's interesting is, whilst this is written in many books as evidence of the crossbow's awesomeness, what people often neglect to mention is that Canon 29 of the Second Lateran Council does indeed say that crossbows shouldn't be deployed against other Christian enemies, but it also says archers. So the very point that this is often used to illustrate is that crossbows were so formidable and so, you know, wiping out the enemy, like mowing them down like some kind of medieval machine gun. But hilariously, in the same sentence, the Pope actually says crossbowmen and archers. And now there is some debate about what precisely that means, but the commonly accepted translation is, and I quote, "We prohibit under anathema, can't say that word very well, that murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians and Catholics from now on." I don't know why it says Christians and Catholics, because presumably that's the same thing at that period. Maybe, I suppose it could mean Orthodox and Catholics. Anyway, so there we go. So it says crossbowmen and archers, and in another thing apparently there's a mention of slingers as well. So actually it's not saying anything at all about how mean and evil and effective crossbows were. It was just talking about missile weapons, basically all the missile weapons of the day, crossbowmen and archers. So that would have included longbows and every other type of, you know, recurve bow, every other type of bow. So there we go. Kind of interesting, I think. But indeed, the Second Lateran Council doesn't only talk about crossbows and bows being used, you know, between Christian armies, which of course incidentally we know that they continued to be, so everyone just ignored the Pope in 1139, and apparently this was later re-emphasized, this Canon 29, and so therefore, you know, it was being ignored and it continued to be ignored. But in fact, bows and crossbows aren't the only thing which come under the attention of the Pope and the Second Lateran Council. The other thing which comes under their attention is in Canon 14, and they say, I quote, "We entirely forbid, moreover, those abominable jousts and tournaments in which knights come together by agreement and rashly engage in showing off their physical prowess and daring, and which often result in human deaths and danger to souls." You know, what does this boil down to? Well, I suppose it's the Pope's attempt at trying to minimise the deaths being caused, if we just look at the bows and crossbows for a second, the deaths being dealt out between Christian armies, because of course in 1139 what were the papacy were most concerned with trying to protect the Holy Land and regain areas from Muslim control, essentially. And defending Christendom. So presumably their motivation was to try and turn Christian armies, or encourage urge Christian armies less into slaying each other and more into slaying everyone else in the world. But additionally, this thing about jousts and tournaments, now we know that in 1139, so this is relatively early on in the history of jousts and tournaments, in fact, and jousts in 1139 were sometimes pretty bloody affairs, and the kind of, you've got to bear in mind they're in gambesons and mail, so they don't have fantastic protection against lances, and they did have two types of joust at this time. They had the joust of peace and the joust of war. In the joust of war, they literally used sharp lances, and of course we know later on people like William Marshall, for example, William the Marshal sometimes, took part in these kind of mass melee tournaments where everyone was just clouting each other with swords and taking each other hostage and literally ransoming them back to the other side. So they were sometimes basically like little organised wars, little skirmishes. Very different from the later idea of tournaments and jousts, which were more of a kind of sanitised, relatively to the time anyway, sanitised show with spectators, and where it was very rare for anyone to get seriously hurt. But in this earlier period, it was more like kind of like, fuck it, there's no war going on this year. Let's beat the living crap out of each other, and basically let's just do this for fun and for money and glory and fame and everything else, and perhaps to take the losers' horses and armour and maybe their whatever. So there we go. This is this Second Lateran Council. The first thing, the main thing I really want to highlight is this wasn't the famous, the Pope thinks crossbows are the ultimate killing machine and must ban them. This wasn't the case. The Pope was speaking out against all types of archers, not just crossbows and crossbowmen, but also conventional handheld bows. And additionally, in this very same thing, the Pope also goes and stop all those tournaments and beating the crap out of each other just for the hell of it. So there we go. I hope that's more or less interesting. And let's try and spread this information and get rid of this myth that crossbows were somehow the medieval menace, killing machine, mowing down loads of the enemy, and that the crossbow was somehow a vastly more effective and lethal weapon than the longbow was, because it wasn't. Cheers for watching, folks. See you for the next video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.